Good morning, friends. Today I want to return to Matthew chapter 26, verse 17 and 25 to pick up on several narrative details that we just couldn't get to this past Sunday, since we spent our time together focusing entirely on the ideas of God's sovereignty and man's free will as we see it in terms of God ordaining that Jesus be betrayed and then Judas being held accountable for actually doing the betrayal. And you can, of course, get the full message there on this channel from Sunday, and then we'll expound on it in our future devotions this week. But for right now, we're not going to go there. We're going to go to the other details. I'm not going to read the passages in its entirety again. You can do that your own, or if you're already familiar with it. But the gist of the passage is that Jesus is directing his disciples concerning the place where they're going to celebrate the Passover. And there's a lot of meat there that we could chew into as well. But most of those details come from the other gospel authors rather than Matthew. So since Matthew doesn't major on those things, we won't either right now. But because Matthew seems to really focus on our Lord's announcement once the Passover meal begins that he is about to be betrayed. And particularly that he is about to be betrayed by his own people. And that's the first detail I want to focus on today, because in verse 23, Jesus says, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me." Now, oftentimes people try to use this as sort of a puzzle or the key to a puzzle, trying to figure out who it is. I mean, we know who's going to betray him, but this is before the fact. So who is Jesus indicating is going to betray him based on, who happens to have their hand in the dish at the same time as Jesus while they're eating their meal. But in all likelihood, this isn't what Jesus is going for. Because in talking about dipping their hand in the dish with me, Jesus is referring to a custom of that day where there would be a main dish that had a sort of broth in it where everybody could reach that, and the broth was made up of mashed fruit, dates, figs, raisins, along with water and vinegar. And the thing is that all of the apostles, all of the men sharing that meal together, would have been dipping their morsels of food in that dish together throughout the meal. And so the point here isn't to try to indicate specifically who it was that would betray Jesus, but rather Jesus is highlighting the nature of the betrayal. Because it's true today, but it was especially true in the culture of Jesus' day, that to share a meal with someone in this manner was a matter of intimate association, which is exactly why the Pharisees always made a big deal out of Jesus eating his meals so often with tax collectors and even prostitutes. Because in doing so, he was associating with them on a deep level. He was identifying with them in some sense. And he was doing so in a very relational way. And considering the sinful lifestyle of these people, the Pharisees thought that what Jesus was doing by eating with them was disgusting. They would never have associated on that deep and intimate level with such horrible sinners. And so taking a meal with someone, dipping your hand in the same bowl with them, indicated a close and intimate relationship with that person, whether it be a family member, a close friend, or even a committed follower. And so when Jesus says, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me," far more likely than not, he's emphasizing that it isn't going to be someone on the periphery. It's not going to be some obscure actor on the fringes of his band of followers. No, the person who will betray him will be one of his closest friends, his closest associates. He will be betrayed by someone who pretends to be in an intimate relationship with him. And obviously, that being the case, that intensifies the betrayal. It intensifies both the pain and the egregious nature of the betrayal, right? Because whether we've seen it in someone else's life, or even as an example in a movie, or we probably have experienced it in our own personal lives, when we are betrayed, it is so much worse when we find ourselves, in light of the betrayal, saying, "But we were friends," or "We were married. I loved you. I was faithful to you, but you betrayed me." that deep intimacy. So I really don't think Jesus says what he does here in order to add some mysterious element so that we can figure out the puzzle box as to who's going to betray him before it happens. No, he's informing the apostles that one of them will betray him. That betrayal will be an egregious act of evil, especially because it will come from someone in his inner circle, one of Jesus' closest relationships. And that leads these men to question even themselves. Because had Jesus said simply and generically, one of you will betray me, with no further clarification, just kind of keeping it open like that, then each one of them could have thought, well, he must mean one of the disciples in the whole group is going to betray him. But certainly that wouldn't be any of us apostles here in his inner circle. But since Jesus says one who dips his hand in the bowl with me, now they have to wonder. He's talking about the people in his inner circle. Could it be me? My hand has been in the bowl with Jesus already this evening. I've been sharing this meal with him. Am I capable of such betrayal? And we're told that each of the apostles, save for Judas, of course, each of them were filled with sorrow. And we can imply, therefore, that they were also filled with fear that it might be them, even as they asked Jesus, in turn, each one of them, is it I, Lord? And you know what? This is actually a wonderful display of humility on the part of those apostles. Because at least on this occasion, none of them respond arrogantly saying, well, not me. No, they're going to have some struggles with that one in a little bit. But at least right now, they respond correctly with humility. Apparently understanding their own weakness, the idea that they might be capable of such betrayal, or at least fearing that they could be capable of such betrayal. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to ask, is it I, Lord? And I find this, and this might be kind of ironic here, but I find this comforting because it reminds us that as Christians, as God's people, we are still susceptible to weakness. If an apostle of Jesus Christ in our Lord's immediate physical presence, if they are capable of worrying that they might sin so egregiously as to betray their own Lord, then we can take comfort in that fact, because we know that we sin against the Lord too. But we are reminded once again that our salvation is not based on our ability to be good enough or to sin little enough in order to keep our salvation. No, our salvation is based on Christ's own righteousness and his grace in taking our penalty on himself. And in light of this, lest we think that we can just willy-nilly sin as a result, since Christ and his grace and we don't have to do anything, well, we are reminded that the apostles are horrified to think that they might be capable of betraying Jesus. So in the same way, our salvation is not contingent on us never sinning again. It's not contingent on us being good enough. But still, the sin that remains in our lives, or the sin that we might be capable of, still ought to horrify us, ought to make us sorrowful. Because each sin that we commit is like a mini betrayal of Jesus, choosing ourselves in that moment, choosing ourselves and our own desires in that sin over him, rather than him and his desires for righteousness. And so this reminds us that our salvation is based on the grace of God, not on our own performance, but we are still motivated to pursue holy and godly living, because if we do indeed belong to a holy God, that's the only kind of living that makes sense. And finally, we're told how Judas speaks to Jesus at this point. Because again, apparently every last one of the apostles is asking Jesus, is it I, Lord? And obviously it'd look really bad if Judas didn't follow suit. But we'll notice something different about how Judas asks his question. Because where everyone else is asking, is it I, Lord? Judas asks, is it I, Rabbi? Or in other words, is it I, teacher? Everyone else calls him Lord, Master. Judas calls him teacher. And that is very telling, because Judas does not actually believe in Jesus for who he really is. He is like so many unbelievers today. A great teacher? Sure. But the Lord, the one who ought to have mastery over my life? No. But that also gives us a good indicator of why none of the other apostles actually did betray Jesus in the way Judas did. Yes, Peter will deny Jesus in time. We'll talk about that in depth when we get there. And all the apostles did indeed abandon Jesus later on that very night. But none of them betrayed Jesus like Judas did. And the reason is because despite their fear, despite their weakness, they knew and believed that he was the Lord. But Judas was willing to outright betray him because he did not see Jesus as a sovereign Lord, the authoritative master of his life. And that is the difference between humility and godly sorrow over sin and receiving God's grace in light of that sin unto salvation. The difference between that and betraying Christ for what the world has to offer instead, and as a result coming to a very, very bad end. So let us live in that humility, friend. Let us declare and submit to Jesus as Lord. For if we do that, we may have sin. We may even deny Christ and flee from him for a spell, as I have in my younger years. But by God's grace, we will never fully betray him. And he will not let us, but will raise us up, each one on the last day. I pray you have a good and godly day. And Lord willing, I'll see you soon.